Now, today's topic is on system options, and I didn't realize till you really get in there how much or how big this topic really is. I created a couple polls, as we always start with a few polls to take a look at what kind of things that people are looking to get out of this. So first question, very simple question. Hopefully most of you get this right. System options in SolidWorks affect what? Every document or only the active document? Okay, we got 56% voted. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this and share with you the results. As you can see here, the answer is every document. System options affect how we work within the interface and how we interact with every single document that opens up. We're going to go through a good portion of the system options today. Next one. I want to know how often you're in your system options. As I went through the system options, it quickly became clear that you could change day to day how easily you work within the environment just by going in and understanding your system options and what you have available to you. My hope today is to introduce you to some system options that maybe you didn't even know were in there, and you might be able to pop in and out and tweak from time to time to make life easier depending on the job. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close that. I'll share with you the results. Just as I expected, it's about a 50-50 split. There's so many options in there. It's kind of hard to get through some of that. And my last one, and this is just kind of a fun one here. I didn't even realize the answer. How many tabs are there in system options? When you go to system options, you have the different categories off to the left. How many different tabs are in there? And that's when I started talking about how big this topic really is. You start to realize real quickly that there's a lot in there. Give a few more seconds here. Okay, we'll go ahead and close and share. And the answer is the 23. There's 23 different tabs in system options that we can work with. So back to my PowerPoint for a minute here. What we're going to talk about today is a review of the system options, and there's no way we could possibly discuss with examples every bit of options in the system options. I'm going to kind of pick and choose a few from several different tabs, ones that I feel are maybe important that I've seen, and others that are just maybe you didn't know were even there, that you had a choice to turn them on or turn them off. And then I'm going to leave 15 minutes at the end for you to, through the question section, just ask me about other options. If there's a particular tab or a particular option you're just not clear on, now I may have to refer to the help because that's sometimes where I have to go to get clarification on some of these. And to be clear, these options seem to be very dynamic. One service pack, there's an option there. Next service pack, it's disappeared. It's on a different tab. There's a lot of things as I went through this I didn't even know were even in there anymore. And as I stated before, system options, be clear on this, they affect every open document. Now, what I originally wanted to do is go through and highlight a couple different options from each of the tabs, but it quickly became almost too large for an hour-long session. So we're going to jump right into the software and start under the general options. General to me means SolidWorks didn't have another location to fit them. So it's really just a conglomeration of all sorts of different things in one miscellaneous pile. So let's jump over to SolidWorks for a moment. Our system options, as we all know, can be accessed from our standard toolbar. I find the other thing that I do initially right off the bat is I go to my Tools Customize and Keyboard, and I make sure that I set up a hotkey for my options. So I have my hotkey set to O. Either command will work. Now when I'm talking about the 23 different tabs, these are the topic headers off to the left-hand side here. So general being the very first of them. And I'm going to go, some of these aren't going to make a difference in your world, some of them will make a difference. But I want to clarify how some of these commands work. The very first one in here, open last documents at startup. This one, the only way to get this to work the way you would expect it to, you have two choices: never open up the last document or always. Now if I tell it to always open it, I'm going to go say okay here. I'm going to go ahead and close that part file I had open, then close SolidWorks. And what you'll notice here, minimize this, when I open SolidWorks back up, you would think based upon that option that it would launch that previous document. And you can see it clearly does not. To get this option to work, if I have it at always, I want to open up the document or whatever my last document happens to be. I'll grab one here. Now the key to this is to close down SolidWorks without closing down the document, because this open last documents will open anything you had open in SolidWorks when you last closed. So everything, let's say, saved and so on, I can close the session. Now if I open up SolidWorks, it should pull up the very last document that I was working with. Now, where does that come into handy? Maybe you got a large assembly that you always want to open up in the morning. You know, you come in, you open up SolidWorks, you don't have to sit there wait for SolidWorks to open, then do a file open on the assembly. It will always open up the particular assembly. That way you can enjoy your first cup of coffee maybe a little longer than most. Input dimension value. We're all used to sketching on a plane, and as we're placing a dimension on here, we're able to put in a dimension value, and the modify box actually comes up. Now, let me rotate myself on my screen here and get something a little closer. If I turn that option off, not sure exactly where you want to use this, but it just places the dimension and allows you to move on. The modify box does not come up. However, if you double click on the dimension, the modify box will come up. So you do still have a way of getting there. It just doesn't prompt you for the dimension right off the bat. And you'll have to, excuse me, I have to be careful so I get things put back the way they were. Single command per pick. This is a neat little option that I've used from time to time when I'm doing certain things to make sure I don't have to be turning on and off tools a lot. Single command per pick basically is exactly that. Anything I make a selection on, I'm going to use that command one time. So if I want a line, I grab my line tool, I draw that line, and then the line command is automatically shut off. Single command per pick. If I then grab my Smart Dimension tool, place it onto a line, my modify box comes back up, but notice as soon as I accept it, my dimension tool is now also gone. Now, if you're creating multiple lines, multiple dimensions, doing a bunch of that, then single command per pick isn't going to really help you much. But that's what that one does. Now, there is also an option in here. I'm not going to be able to show this exactly, but shows thumbnail graphics in Windows Explorer. This is what actually shows the graphics, the thumbnails, images instead of the icon in Windows Explorer. Okay, I'm going to move down about halfway down the screen here. Enable confirmation corner. Some of you don't know necessarily what the confirmation corner is. If you look on my screen off to the right here in the background, you can see the little pencil for exit sketch and cancel. That is the confirmation corner. Some of you do or don't like to use that to exit out of sketches. You can actually turn that off. Now, if you were to turn that off and you're in a sketch, you can't exit it obviously from here. But as SolidWorks always has been able to do, if you right-click, your exit sketch is right there on your right-click menu, so you can get in and out as well. If you wanted to just cancel the sketch, that one would be a little bit harder to do because there is no cancel. Let me see. I don't see no cancel from here. So cancel would discard the changes. You would end up exiting the sketch and then deleting to discard. Okay, so it does add a few steps in there if you were to use that. Auto Show Property Manager. Sometimes your focus is directly on the feature tree or on another tab or a third-party program, and as you're making selections in the graphics interface of SolidWorks, that the Property Manager pops up automatically. That's because of this option in here. And just to illustrate that point, let's just edit a sketch here. If I select any item from within that sketch, you can see that the Property Manager for that sketch item shows up automatically. If I pick dimensions, we're all used to this way of working, that the Property Manager kind of works right along with us. But if I wanted to, for some reason, always focus on, maybe I'm working on configurations. I wanted to keep my configuration tab up so I remembered what configurations I was dealing with. By turning that off now, I can make my selections, and notice it doesn't trigger the Property Manager to come up at all. Okay. Now, how do we get that up from here? That is a good question. I believe we actually have to invoke the command. Let's see if there's properties here. Sketch entity properties. There you go. So you actually physically have to right-click on the entity, go under the right-click header under selected entity, and select properties there to get that to come up. Okay, again, not sure if any of you use some of this stuff, but it does change the way we work within the interface. Down a little bit further, enable Feature Expert. Now, first of all, what is the Feature Expert? I think I've shown this in a couple previous webinars, but let's take a look at what the Feature Expert is. In this particular part, I need to break all the corners with a certain fillet size. And I decide to come in here, grab all the edges, tell it I want a 1 millimeter fillet, and go ahead and accept the command. What happens is the Feature Expert is now available to me to try to fix the problem. Now, this is one way in which Feature Expert shows its head within SolidWorks. Feature Expert is really built into draft tools and within the filleting tool. Its intention is to try to fix any problems you have with the order in which draft and fillets are added to the model. Now, if I select Feature Expert in this case, the software goes ahead and tries to resolve the order in which it requires those features to be added in order to solve the problem that I wanted, which in this case is the breaking of all corners at 1 millimeter. If you look at the feature tree, I now have multiple fillets that make up the 1 millimeter breaks. Now, what does that mean from a system option perspective? Now, if I come in here and turn off Enable Feature Expert and perform that same action, okay, what you'll see is that box will disappear. So you cannot use that program to recalculate. Now, here's why some people may or may not want that, because what it actually does is it reorders features. Okay, if you don't want it to reorder features on you to try to solve for best order, you may turn that off. Okay, I don't necessarily know of any other particular reason why we would not want that. Okay, back into our options. A new one for 2012 This was shown at the What's New rollouts in your particular region, what we call the freeze bar. The freeze bar has to be turned on as a system option. Now, what the freeze bar does is it adds a bar kind of like the rollback bar, except it starts at the top, and you can drag that bar down past any number of features, and it physically locks them from being recalculated on a rebuild. So if you have a very large plastic part that you do want to cut down the rebuild time, or you already know that this section is completed, you don't need to rebuild them every time. Now when I do a Control Q or a force rebuild, it only has to rebuild the plane, the cut, the mirror, and the split line. Everything else above it is locked in place. Now if I right click on any of those, you'll notice that you cannot edit them in this freeze mode. But once again, it is a system option that you have to turn on to enable the freeze bar, and unfortunately the freeze bar by default in 2012 is off. So unless you remember to turn it on, you may not remember it is even available to you in 2012. Okay. When rebuild errors occur, what do you want the software to do? Do you want it to continue? Do you want it to prompt? Or do you want it to stop? Now, the default is prompt. Now, what does this mean to you? Let's close this down for a moment. Let's open a part that has some problems. This is from the training. Okay. Now, when I do a rebuild, this is where the question gets asked. If I have it set to prompt, okay, now the reason I bring in a lot of these things up is people, often, why do I keep seeing this dialogue? Why do I have to keep seeing this? When I do a rebuild, it's prompting me for what I want to do next. Now, I can continue, in other words, rebuild the rest of the tree as best you can and then stop. So ignore the error. Or you can tell it to stop where the error exists and repair it. So it almost forces you right to the error and makes you repair. Now this is a choice now. I can tell it to stop and repair, and it will roll back the bar right to where I want to stop, and it brings up my what's wrong dialog and allows me to fix it. Now, the options allow me to pick what I really want to happen. If I don't want to see that box and I understand what happens when there's errors, I can tell it, you know what, I want it to continue to the end, rebuild the rest of the way, and ignore the error if I ever open a file with that or rebuild. And you'll notice that if I do a Control Q, it brings me right to the what's wrong. Okay. Now, another option, system option, is whether or not we want to see what's wrong, this dialog. And it can be turned on and off right here in the dialog box, display what's wrong during rebuild. Or I'm going to go to a different tab here. If I go to System Options, at the very bottom is Messages, Errors, and Warnings, and there's that same option, Show Errors Every Rebuild. Now, here's an example of what it looks like in a clean environment when you understand that it's not going to prompt me for any issues. Okay, and it's not going to show me a what's wrong dialog. If I do a force rebuild, I don't have dialog boxes bombarding me. I can clearly look at the feature tree and see, oh yeah, I have some issues here. But I'm not bombarded with dialog boxes. Again, for maybe a seasoned veteran, somebody's been using SolidWorks for a little bit longer, it makes life a little bit easier to not have some of those dialogues around. I'm going to set mine back to prompt. One other thing in this tab I want to point out, show latest news feeds in task pane. With that on, off to the right in our task pane, under the Home or Resources tab, under Community, you will find Technical Alerts and News. Well, SolidWorks has to get this from an RSS feed through the internet, so it actually uses up a little bit of resources to get information about what's going on in SolidWorks. at this point. This option will turn that off. All right, now when I go here, you can see under Community, there's nothing under Technical Alerts and News. It's a great way to find out, for those of you who are wondering, that Service Pack 1 has already been released for SolidWorks 2012. SP1 has been available for a couple days now. Okay. Now, one last one on that page, SolidWorks Customer Experience Improvement Program. When you install SolidWorks, you have the choice of sending log files to SolidWorks when you have issues. This is the option that makes that happen. Now, I'll speak from experience. We've had organizations that have had problem with crashing or other things going on. We can actually go to SolidWorks if there's some real issues and gather up your logs and find out what areas you're most having problems with and what machines and what user. It does provide with some clear pictures. If you turn this on all the time, it should be very little to no interference with how you work within the interface. Okay. Now I'm going to jump down to the Sketch tab for a moment. There's a few new things on the Sketch tab for 2012. First one is Auto Rotate View Normal to Sketch Plane on Sketch Creation. This was also shown in the What's New. I'm just going to rotate the model here. If I select front plane and insert a sketch, you can see that it brings me normal too. Let's open up a part here. Bring our diaphragm back in here. If I grab my right plane and I open a sketch, it brings me normal too. Okay, so whatever plane we select, it's going to bring me normal to that particular plane using that option. Auto Rotate View Normal. There's an option in here also to use fully defined sketches. For a new user who's learning how to define sketches, this sometimes is a useful tool. Use fully defined sketches. What this does is when you're in the sketch environment and for some reason there is an underdefined situation like this here, and I go to exit the sketch, the software will no longer allow me to exit the sketch. It will require me to fully define in order to move on. Now, for those who are new users that are really smart about it, will know that you can just right-click and use the option called Fully Define Sketch to add the remaining values needed to define it. Just a little tidbit I want to throw in there. Okay, back to Sketch here for a moment. These two here, I currently have them off. They're usually by default on. Displaying arc center points in part or assembly sketches or displaying entity points in part or assembly sketches. Let's start with arc center points. So let's just open on the front plane a sketch here. And we'll go normal too because I turned off my option. And let's just select a 3-point arc and place one on there. Now, with that option on to display arc center points, you can see the center of the arc at all times to be able to dimension too. Now, if I go in there under Sketch and turn off display arc center points, you can see that I can't see it. However, you can still pick it up. Okay, you can still dimension to it. You know, in a very busy sketch with a lot of things going on, you may want to tweak that just a little bit. Let me turn off Use Fully Defined Sketch here for a moment. Okay, now if I go into an existing sketch, the endpoints of sketch geometry, the way I've always been describing it is, think of that as a ball, and the color of that ball describes whether that ball is fully defined, underdefined, overdefined. Well, sometimes those points just kind of make things look a little bit odd, or you don't want to see those points. That's what the other option does in here under Sketch. Display entity points, which is the endpoints. Now you can see when I'm in a sketch, I have nice smooth corners, but I don't have those big circular balls that show you if something's underdefined, fully defined, or overdefined. That is the one downfall of that, is that you can't see that condition on the endpoints. That being said, you can still make the selection of all the endpoints if need be. Okay. Prompt to close sketch. I'm not really thinking that one right yet. Let's use our help. If we hit help right in here, let's see what prompt to close sketch would be. Okay. I wasn't feeling that one for a moment. Let's, I got an example here. Let's see. If you're doing a revolve, let's say, and this was really intended to be a closed profile, and you never drew the line across the center, prompt to close sketch is the dialog that pops up and asks the question, would you like to close the sketch? So if I do a revolve here, it tells me the sketch is currently open, a non-thin revolution requires a closed sketch. Would you like it to be automatically closed? Now, let's cancel that for a moment. If I go in here to my sketch and tell it to turn that off, the prompt to close sketch, and then perform a revolve, should just automatically do it for me. Well, it doesn't seem to be wanting to turn off, but that's what prompts you for that close. It should close that out automatically for you. Okay, so prompt to close sketch. Let's see what else we got in here. At the very bottom here, we have two things I want to point out. Ghost image on drag. When you're dragging a sketch entity, see how where the previous position was is kind of in a light gray? That's that ghosting that occurs. It doesn't seem to take much of a hit on performance, but if I do turn that off under the sketch, you will get no ghosting, as you can see here. Enable on-screen numeric input on entity creation. There's several things that kind of go along with this one. On-screen input on entity creation. So let's just go to my sketch tools here. I'm going to grab my line, and I'm going to place my first endpoint of the line. Now, as I'm drawing that line out, you'll notice that it provides me with the input dimension dialog, so I can actually type in a number. So if I knew I wanted this line to be 50 millimeters, I type in 50, hit enter, and that line will automatically be placed at that length. Now, you'll notice what it didn't do is put the dimension on there and lock it to some dimension size. But I do still have my line tool to come in here and start placing other geometry. Now, the alternative to this, or a command that kind of goes along with it, if I grab my line command, you'll notice on my line property manager I have an option to add dimensions. Now, with these two things on, if I'm coming in here drawing a line, I can say, okay, I want a 50 millimeter line. It will physically add the dimension, say 50-25. You know, I can get the dimensions added automatically as I'm sketching. Okay. Now, those are slightly different than if you were to, let's say, add a circle. If I add a circle in here, I still get the dimension dialog. If I type in the diameter here, it will set the circle, but you'll notice that it didn't add the dimension. This is because the circle command also has the option to add dimensions. Okay, so I'm going to actually turn both those off, add dimensions. There you go. So that's where that numeric input on Sketch, on entity creation. Now, hopefully at this point everyone understands about over-defining dimensions. Dimensions that, if you add too many of them, make your geometry change color because it's over-defining the position and size of some of the geometry. Now, let's take a look for a moment at, let's see, sketch here. Here's a fully defined sketch, meaning all the size and location of all the geometry and endpoints have been positioned properly. But if I come in here and decide to place a dimension between the end and the center of the circle, when I go to place this, okay, you can see that it automatically made it over-defined. Now, it made it over-defined because it's trying to add this dimension as what we call a driving dimension. A driving dimension is a dimension that drives, will physically change and alter the geometry. Now, there is another type of dimension called a driven dimension. If I select that same dimension and go to the third tab, there's an option for driven. A driven dimension is a dimension you cannot change. It's driven by the position of the geometry. So it's kind of, you're not driving the sketch is driving the dimension. It's kind of making it in reverse. Now the reason I bring this all up is because in the options, under Sketch, we can dictate to the software how we want it to solve for over-defining dimensions. So as soon as you add one that's over-defining, the default setup is to prompt to set the driven state. Now what that means is if I'm going to add this, the software is going to give me a choice. Do I want to leave this dimension driving or make it driven? Okay. Now again, this is going to be a set of options for you to work with here. If I go to my sketch, I can say, you know what, set it driven by default. Okay, so set driven by default will automatically make this not go over defined, but this dimension is no longer editable using standard modified techniques. It's driven by the geometry. So you have the choice of how you want that to react. The default setup on that is prompt to set driven state. Okay. Next area I want to take you is under display selection. There's a few things under here that I want to point out. First set is as it relates to the selection of hidden edges. People often get confused when you're able to select more than you really want to be able to, or you can't select something you feel like you should be able to. Well, let's take a look at an assembly here for a moment. Okay, and let's start with our first option in there under display selection. Allow selection of hidden edges in wireframe and hidden line visible mode. So if I take this into a wireframe, okay, I'm able to select edges that are on the back side of the model. Now, if I go back in there and I turn that off, okay, I can't pick, oh, this is still, because it's in wireframe, still allowing me to pick through it. Hidden lines visible. Yeah, they both still allow you to make that selection. I'm not sure why that makes sense, why it works, but still allows you to make your selection through in those modes. The other one is probably the more important, is allow selection in hidden line remove and shaded modes. This is the one that gets people kind of in the most quandary here. If I have it in a shaded mode, and you're thinking that you can only make selection to edges that are shown in the shaded state, but you start getting in here and I could pick edges through the existing geometry, okay, with that on, which could be nice in some cases if you want to make a pick through something. But having that on by default maybe is not the best way to handle that. Part or assembly tangent edge display. Okay, so how do you want the tangent edges where a fillet meets another component to look? I can set them as phantom, which they show up in kind of a dotted phantom line, or I can set them as removed, which is just a little bit different way of looking at it, where you don't see that interface between the fillet and the other edge. Okay, so there's some options in there. I'll turn off my allow selection options. One down here, assembly transparency for in-context edits. We get to choose what happens to the other components when I do an in-context edit. Meaning when I edit a part inside of an assembly. Now I'm going to set mine to the default, which is just make it opaque, opaque assembly. So what that means is if I right-click on a component and select Edit Part, the rest of the components I'm editing will maintain their color and their opacity settings. Now, if I go back in there for a moment, we can tell it to maintain assembly transparency, which means if any of the components already have transparency set in SolidWorks, it will maintain it. It will stay 75% transparent. Or we can tell it to force transparency. I could tell it to be, to about 80% transparent and say OK. So now the component that I'm editing, okay, will still be opaque. The other components will be transparent. Now, the transparency settings are it's kind of weird because you're still seeing all the edges. This is because of the display style being set to shaded with edges. If you set it to shaded, everything will look transparent. That is, not being edited at this point. Okay. Now this is where you set the default. There is another method for changing this, however. On the assembly toolbar in the assembly environment, you'll find assembly transparency. It's a pull-down menu where you can pick from the three options. It's currently set to force, which I have set in my system options. Okay. Okay, at the bottom here, highlight all edges of features selected in the graphics view. Let me exit out of edit mode here for a moment. I'm going to give myself some edges back. And I'm going to turn my fillet edges back on so we can see those as well. Now if I pick the face of a fillet without dealing with this next option, it just highlights the face that I've selected for that fillet, even though the rest of these faces might be part of that same feature. This option, with it turned on, it will highlight all the edges of the features when you select them in the graphics view. So now, if I select the fillet, it selects all the edges, shows you all the edges that were used in that fillet feature. If I select one of these features, okay, this was added all the way around the model in a couple different spots. It's kind of nice to be able to see all the different areas that were created with a fillet all in one shot. Okay. Dynamic highlight from graphics view. This really has to do with how the software deals with sketches and parts in the graphics area. For instance, if I were to take a sketch here, let me find one and show it. Make sure my view sketches is available. I have some dynamic highlighting where I can pick up lines and arcs and center points of that sketch inside the assembly or inside the part. But I can actually turn off those dynamic things from happening. If I turn off dynamic highlight from graphics view, it doesn't become referenceable. I can make selections, but as I mouse over it, you'll notice it's not giving me any feedback. Again, if you have a very large assembly, lots of sketches, lots of things to inference, this may be something that you would want to tweak off so that you didn't have to deal with that. A couple other things that I have turned on here. There's two at the bottom: display dimensions flat to screen and display notes flat to screen. Right now, dimensions, let's go to a new part here. And I just want to create a simple part. Right now, when I show dimensions, okay, see how they stay flat to the plane that they're on? Well, this makes them almost unreadable when you're at an angle. So that thickness becomes unreadable. Now, under the option display dimensions flat to screen, this is actually the old way SolidWorks used to do it. Now the dimensions will be flat and facing the user. So as I rotate the model, I can still see that it's 12.7. So all those dimensions will continue to rotate flat on the screen for you. Sometimes it's nice to have that availability. Okay, and the same goes for notes. If you want notes to do that, if I turn this off, the notes are going to rotate with the plane that the notes were added upon. Okay, on to another tab. We have just a few minutes here. I want to cover a few things in here, and then we'll take some questions on maybe some areas you want to look at. This next section is probably the one set of options that work together that I've probably been asked the most about in my 10 years doing this. External references handles how the software deals with children files. So for an assembly, it would be all the parts. For a drawing, it would be the assembly or the parts that the drawing is made of. They are treated as children or referenced files. Now, two things happen. I either have somebody tell me, when I go to try to do a save, it tries to do a save as on all my parts. Or I have to hit no 100 times because I don't want it to save a bunch of parts. That has to do with this next set of options that I'm dealing with here. The first one in here is titled Open Reference Documents with Read-Only Access. I'm going to close down a few of these here. We're going to actually use this air source. So okay, if I say Open Reference Documents with Read-Only Access, what happens is when I do a file open on the assembly, any reference documents will not be opened with full write access and editability. Now, how can I tell that? I can see the assembly is not read-only because on the title bar where it states the name, it doesn't say read-only here. If I go to my File pull-down menu and go to Find References, you can see in here that each of the referenced subassemblies and components are all opened read-only. Now, what does that mean to you? If you're not using a PDM system, that means that somebody else can open up those documents and make changes to them. Okay? The problem stems from when you wanted to do a save on the document or you've made a change to the assembly, and it's trying to save all the other components. Okay, it's hard for me to illustrate this, but if I want to do a save, it's going to try, because the rest of these documents can't be saved, you don't have write access, it's going to prompt you to do a save as of all the other components if you've made some modifications to them. Maybe you've upgraded them to 2012 format. Okay, that's because of this read-only status. Now, with that on, if I try to open another document, okay, you can see that it says it's read-only. Now, it should have prompted me, let's say I try to make a change here. Let's see, trying to... If it doesn't prompt me, I have to go somewhere else to... So I'm making a change to this document. Okay, you can see it was able to make the change. Now when I hit save, okay, it tells me that it was in read-only. Okay, but it also asks me if I want to do a save as on it. So it's still, in a roundabout way, it does allow me to do a save. One of the options I was looking for here, let me just see if I've dismissed it. Yep. For those of you who have been in SolidWorks and got messages, errors, and warnings, and you've dismissed the dialog, meaning you've said, never ask me this question again. Under the system options, under messages, errors, and warnings, are all the messages that you said do not show me again. And one of mine is, you are about to make changes to the following read-only documents. Now, I'm going to check that. It's basically telling the software to let that dialog show up again. Now let me show you what will happen here. What will happen is, now when I pick another component to edit, okay, here's where that dialog comes up. You're about to make changes to read-only documents. Would you like to open it with full write access? Okay, or it warns you to get full write access to the document. Okay. Now, back under external references, there are times when you open things open as read-only with no intention of ever changing them, and you want to be clear that anything that the software thinks is changed in them is not real. There's an option under external references. Don't prompt me to save any read-only files, any read-only reference documents. You open them read-only for a reason, because they're reference. Because somebody else is working on them, you don't want to change them. There's usually a reason why you do that. So when I go to save, I want it to ignore the fact that SolidWorks thinks that any of these things have changed. So let's say in this case, let's change the color on this part. Okay, it's open read-only. This is just changing it in the graphics area. All right, and I go back to my assembly here. If I were to do a save without that ignore on, it's going to ask me to do a save as on the yellow part, because it knows I've changed read-only, and it knows it can't save it as the same name. But now if I do a save with that on, it's going to ignore the fact that this document has been modified. This won't be saved. Now, if this is working correctly, I can close this all down. I can go ahead and open that same air source, and it should be red when it opens up. And boom. Now, you'll notice that the graphics needed to be updated, but the component never got saved. Okay. Where these options are going to most often affect you are when you're upgrading your parts from one release to another. Because when you open them in SolidWorks, if I were to open up this air source assembly, it thinks that I've changed all of the components because they're now in a 2012 version and not 2011. So when I do a save, it's going to try to do a save as on all of those components. Now I know we've only been able to cover a short portion of the system options. I mean, there's hours and hours worth of information here. So for the last 10 minutes, I'd like to just open it up into the question window and ask you users what tab and what option you'd like me to discuss briefly before we end today. If we don't have anything, I can just keep going for the last 10 minutes. So I'll open it up. If I see any questions, we'll go right at those. Anyone? I'll keep going until I see a question in there for that. Now, another area, does the freeze bar work in assemblies? Not currently. Not currently. Well, let's make sure. Let's make sure here. I don't believe it does. Let's general enable my freeze bar. Yeah, not currently. It does not work in assemblies right now. What is the anti-aliasing under display selection? All right. Let's go under display selection and look at my anti-aliasing. Now, anti-aliasing has to do with the sharpness of the edges of the model and or the sketches, and it's the quality and or thickness of those edges and that sketch geometry. Now let's look at the help definition on this, because I want to get this exact. Determines the extent of how much anti-aliasing work that applies to the model in the graphics area. Anti-aliasing smooths jagged edges, making the appearance look more realistic. So it really has to do with the quality of those edges. Now, if you make a selection that you want anti-alias edges for edges of the model and sketches only, that is an option in here. If you turn that off, you might sacrifice a little bit with quality, but maybe gain a little bit with speed. Okay. Have they added a system option for configurations for this configuration change only? And the answer is no. They have not added that as far as what the default. It's been asked quite a bit. For those who are wondering what that means, is when you go to make a change with parts with configurations, you have the choice between this configuration, all configurations, or specify. What's being asked is if I can set a default so that I know it always goes and changes all, or changes this, or a specified set. Okay, when detailing, I get the message to make the dimension driven or driving. I don't want any of these to be driving. Where can I turn that off? That's going to be back where I was dealing with over defining, because these are still dealing on the drawing end. When you're sketching, when you're detailing, under sketch, over defining dimensions, if you turn off prompt to set state, okay, turn that off and then turn on set to driven by default. Okay, that will make these driven automatically, and it won't ask the question to you to give you the choice. Okay, that's the list of questions. Let me show you a couple other things. We got a few moments here. There's one that's titled spin box increments. Spin box increments are I've always wondered why SolidWorks set them to these increments, but I think they can be very useful. Spin box increments are used all throughout the interface whenever we're dealing with length, angle, or time. It has to do with, when I use the spin box, how much it increments the value. The default, let's say English units, is 0.1 inches. So let's go to a new part here. I'm just going to create a line and put a dimension on it. Now this these little small arrows that you see in a lot of the dialog boxes are what we call spin box. Now if I set this to 59, I can use the spin box to increment it by some value, and this is incrementing by 10 millimeters in this case. Now if I hit this little button in here, it's reset spin increment value, you can actually change the increment to say 0.25 millimeters and modify by a particular value. Okay, it makes sometimes it's easier if you're always going up by quarter of an inch, half inch. You got instead of using 10 by default or some other value by default, this kind of helps you with that. But that's where these spin box increments come into play. It allows you to set what you think is a default increment value for using this. If I'm changing an angular dimension, what is the spin box value? You can see here was my setting for metric. Here's the setting for inches. Okay, so setting up what that default increment is. Now, there's another question here. Is there an option to have right-click pick boxes to add relations in sketches and drawings? Right-click pick boxes to add relations. I'm not sure what we're asking. So let's, if we're in a drawing and we're doing some sketching in a drawing, and I want to add relations, let's add some line in here. Okay, if I were to select maybe an endpoint and a line, if I right click, you do have your options for relations here. Right click pick boxes. Maybe some clarification on this. You do have options to add relations in here. If I make a selection of 2 items, I don't get that dialog box, the in-context menu that you see in the sketch environment that allows me to set make coincident. But if you right click, you will have the same set of relations on the right click menu. Hopefully that answers that question. Okay, why does the spin box not stay at 0.025 when I spin more than 2 times? It jumps to 0.025, i.e. some other value. Let's see what goes on with mine here. If I go to my spin box, let's go back to the part. I can deal with this. Okay. So here, okay, my spin box increment, if I set it here, I could set my increment. This is just temporarily, I believe in here, Phil. This is just for this document. If I reset the spin box value, I can pick the 0.25. And you can see mine stays like this temporarily. I think if we change the system option, so if I go to my spin box and specify this here as the 0.25, it should not change. Let's see here. Now, if I come in, add, okay, it's still the 0.25. It didn't go back to the, so now this becomes the default, and that is an option in here. So my guess here is, well, see, there's not, let's not make default, make default. My guess is this dialog allows you to add, it does in inches. Okay, well, let's change it to inches. All right. All right. The question was about inches. Okay. He says 0.025. I'm going to make that my default even from here. And let's see here. Okay, if I come back in, Yeah, mine's just rounding, but mine seems to be, might be a version problem, Phil. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending today. I hope you, at least got a little bit of insight into some feature or some option that might affect you. If there are particular things that you want to see, different areas and system options, we'll probably run another one of these and try to get into some of the other areas.